my name is Zondo. I am a social investment analyst at Tshikululu Social Investments and will be your facilitator for today's session. Thank you very much for joining us. Today's webinar is the first out of a 5-part webinar series that we will be hosting in partnership with the Just Energy Transition Project Management Unit, which reports back to the presidency. And just a bit of context in terms of why we wanted to start this webinar series. Since 2024, the JET funding platform has had a number of application windows for funding, and since then there are a number of insights that we've gathered per funding window that has highlighted a few gaps in terms of sort of the readiness of organizations and projects that want to access JET funding. And so that really has been the driver for today's webinar, which is titled Institutional Readiness, the Path to Securing Funds for your JET-aligned initiative. So before, kicking off in terms of today's webinar, I would like to start with some housekeeping. Firstly, you will notice that as you come into the meeting, your mic has been muted and so have your cameras. We ask that you continue to keep it that way. If you would like to engage with us, there is a chat as well as a Q&A function for this meeting. So we ask that you please pose any questions and comments in there. And as the facilitator throughout the webinar, we will have touch points for us to read out the questions and have our colleagues respond to them. We do encourage you as well in the chat, please write your name and your organization. It would be great to find out who is here with us. And most importantly, please be respectful and treat all participants and presenters with respect. So into today's webinar, ultimately the objective for today is to build a practical understanding on what exactly entails institutional readiness and how this can support you in accessing JET-aligned funding, and not only JET-aligned funding, but just any grant funding in general. And the focus in particular today will be on governance as a key enabler for this. And so specifically today, what we will be doing is unpacking what institutional readiness means and the key components related to that, as well as providing an opportunity for us to discuss some of the gaps and challenges that you have had and ways in which we can strengthen them. We will then, at the end of today's session, share a self-assessment tool, a governance self-assessment tool that you can use to help you identify and address some of the institutional readiness gaps that you may have. And at the end of the session, we're hoping that everyone will be able to leave here with a better understanding of what exactly our funders look for when assessing institutional readiness, and be able to put you in a position where you are able to identify your own gaps within your organizations and feel better equipped to address those gaps and, more importantly, position your organizations as being funding ready. And so to help us do that today will be a few of my colleagues today. And as per the agenda on the screen, we will start off with an introduction to the JET Project Management Unit, and that will be presented by Joe Maharaj, who's the funding platform manager. I will then hand over to my colleague Matebe Chisiza Asukile, who's a social investment specialist, who will introduce us to Tsikululu Social Investments and sort of the partnership between ourselves as well as the JET PMU, and then delve into really the meat of today's webinar, which is around institutional readiness for the just transition. We will then have a short comfort break, where thereafter we will come back into a breakaway discussion. So I will explain a bit later how we will do that. But after the comfort break, we will each be assigned into 3 breakout rooms with facilitators, where we'll have a facilitated discussion to get a better sense of what are the gaps that what are some of the compliance gaps and institutional readiness challenges that you have, and ways in which others have addressed them. Thereafter, we will come back for a plenary feedback session, just to share insights from the different breakaway sessions, and then close for today. And so that is essentially our agenda for today. But before kicking off and handing over to Joe, we just want to get a sense of who is in the room. And I will now launch a Slido Most of our participants are either representing NPOs or NGOs, so 58% of them. We have 13% who are from the SME space. We do have some funders or those in corporates, and there are some who have answered other. It would be great to find out in the chat as well where or which constituencies those are as well. So with that being said, I will hand over to Joe Maharaj, who will kick us off by just introducing the JET Project Management Unit. Over to you, Joe.
Good morning, everyone. And thank you for joining us. It really is a pleasure to welcome you to the first webinar of the JET Funding Platform webinar series. JET Project Management Unit within the Presidency, together with our partners at Tshikululu Social Investments. We really are delighted that you've taken the time to be with us today, so thank you. As you know, I'm Jo Maharaj, and I'm the manager of the JET Funding Platform. Our funding platform is a team of 5. I'd love it if you guys can turn your cameras on and just raise your hand as I introduce the rest of the team, which includes Carmen Molman, who is our funders analyst, Letsiwe Dlamini, our project analyst, Zara Essa, our junior analyst, and Sipiwe Hlongwane, our administrator. So that is us. And we know that many organizations that are represented in this room today, whether you are NGOs, municipalities, community initiatives, organized labor, or SMEs, you really are already doing important work on the ground. And yet too often we're seeing that strong ideas and committed organizations are struggling to access funding. And that's not because the need isn't there. It's because there are gaps between project ambitions and funder readiness requirements. And that's what today's webinar series is intended to help with, is to bridge that gap. So this isn't a session about gatekeeping funding, and it's actually about opening doors by helping organizations understand what funders look for and how to strengthen their own institutional readiness. So our hope is that these webinars are going to equip you not only to engage with the JET funding platform, but also just to become stronger candidates for funding opportunities more broadly. Let me start with an introduction on the JET PMU, the Project Management Unit, and the work that we do. I just want to say, guys, I'm gonna ignore the chat. It really breaks my train of thought. So I think if there's questions posted, please may I lean on the moderator to keep up with those. And if I haven't by the end of our presentation covered what's been raised, then we can take a moment to address those. So back to the JET PMU, we were established within the Presidency really to help coordinate and to accelerate the implementation of South Africa's Just Energy Transition Investment Plan. So at its heart, the PMU is a task team that is set up to help turn ambition into implementation. And we do that by focusing on 3 broad objectives. The first is finding innovative solutions to implementation challenges that can often slow progress. The second is mobilizing and directing capital flows towards projects that advance the just energy transition. And of course, a lot of the work that the funding platform does is in that space. And the third is ensuring transparency, monitoring, and accountability so that investments deliver meaningful outcomes. So importantly, this work is done in partnership with many stakeholders. You can see them on the bottom of our slide. These are stakeholders that are across government, development finance institutions, philanthropies, international partners. And I think the message really is here that there's no single institution that can deliver this transition alone. Next slide, please. So what do we mean when we say just energy transition? That phrase actually contains 3 equally important words. Just meaning that we ensure that workers, communities, vulnerable groups are not left behind as our country goes through this transition. It's about inclusion, fairness, and creating opportunity alongside change. So the JET is here to put people at the center of South Africa's transition. Energy, the second word, reflects the shift towards cleaner, more sustainable, and more affordable energy systems that can improve the energy security of our country while reducing emissions, right? And this is a trend that already has momentum. The shift towards an economy that is powered by a diversified energy base, where cleaner and cheaper energy features in greater measure, is just quite simply sensible. It's really well aligned to South Africa and South Africans' interests. And then lastly, transition. And that word recognizes that this transformation requires investment, partnership, and coordinated action over time. It's so much more than just an environmental shift here. It is an economic and social transition as well as an environmental one. And really, this transition is only going to succeed if we can get government, business, communities, labor, civil society, and funders to work together. So collaboration is not optional, it is fundamental. And the key here is not getting one stakeholder to move at a time, but getting many stakeholders to move together. Next slide, please. So why was the funding platform created, right? We can stay on that previous slide for a sec. So as the PMU worked across this complex just energy transition landscape, a challenge has become increasingly clear, not the only challenge, but it was one that became increasingly clear. And that is that there's a significant funding need, particularly for grant funding that enables early stage work and capacity building and community initiatives and catalytic projects. So we recognize that many credible organizations are struggling to find the right funders, and while the funders themselves are struggling to identify projects that meet their requirements. And that is why the JET funding platform was established, to help bridge that gap. Over to the next slide, please. So how does a JET funding platform work? We can go one first. Perfect. Really the simplest way to think about the funding platform is as a matchmaker. Okay, so guys, bad news, we do not have a bank account full of money waiting to deploy. What we have on one side are a bunch of grant funders, and they include international partners, DFIs, development finance institutions, philanthropies, corporates, the likes. And on the other side are organizations that are implementing projects on the ground that are JET aligned. So that's NGOs, SMEs, community-based organizations, trade unions, government organizations. And it's our role to help connect these two groups while also providing project prep support so that promising initiatives can become investment ready. We focus, as you can see on the right-hand side of the slide, on some 4 very broad themes that within the JET. So that's economic diversification and enterprise development, skills development and workforce transition, community and local government support, and clean energy and innovative just transition models. So that is a mouthful, right? And that is a wide ambit. So if you are familiar with the funding platform, then you'll have seen that we generate our project pipeline by opening up call for proposal windows. And we've adapted this approach so that it allows us to actually have thematic windows that we open, because the ambit of the JET is just, it's so vast. So this approach of thematic windows, it really provides us with the ability to assess projects on individual merits, but also on a comparative basis. And it allows us, by having a structured process with timelines, we can also leverage industry experts into the evaluation process. Because as you've seen, we're a team of 5. We cannot purport to know everything that is within the ambit of the JET. Next slide, please. So how do we assess project quality? So like I said, the funding platform follows the structured process from project application through to assessment, and the successful projects are admitted onto our project register, and that is the point at which we begin facilitating engagement with potential funders. And from that point onwards, it's really the funder requirements that govern the approval process and the associated timelines. But the part of the process that the funding platform is really accountable for is that project screening. And in this regard, we look to score proposals in terms of alignment to the JET, of course, and their impact and their sustainability. So that is a lens that applies to all projects, and that is what's in the yellow block. But we also look at the criteria that are in the green blocks in the slide: transition enabling outcomes, community empowerment and ownership, transformational outcomes, climate impact. But what I want to say is that it's important to note that in those green blocks, there is no negative scoring. It's just that project applications can pick up stronger scores in these green block criteria depending on the specific nature of the project. So essentially what we've designed is a methodology where JET alignment, impact, and sustainability are fundamental, but the methodology is flexible enough to appraise projects that are aligned to specific areas within that wide breadth of the JET. And really it is the strongest applications that we see are the ones that demonstrate not only a compelling idea, but a clear pathway to implementation, measurable impact, and benefits for affected communities. Next slide, please. Okay, so what have we learned? This is data from Windows 1 and 2. So the slide captures one of the most important lessons that from our experience of last year. You'll see that this year we've opened a third window, which is currently being adjudicated. So very soon we'll be able to supplement this data with the findings from our third window. But what's up here on the slide is what we've found from the applications in Windows 1 and 2 that were previously opened. And really what we saw was a significant number of organizations or projects that fell away simply because not because the ideas lacked merit, but because they did not meet basic governance and compliance requirements. So the common issues are, they include things like missing founding documents, expired or unavailable SARS or a tax compliance documentation, incomplete KYC information, or insufficient disclosure relating to governance requirements. And we also found that many projects had exciting concepts, but they had not yet fully articulated the broader systemic impact or demonstrated the organizational capacity that was required to absorb and to manage the level of funding that was being requested. So I want to stress all that we're sharing these observations not to discourage anyone, but rather to encourage preparation. Because the encouraging news is that many of these gaps are entirely fixable. Improving governance, strengthening compliance, putting robust organizational systems in place, it can really dramatically improve funding readiness. And in fact, that's exactly why we're hosting this webinar series, is to help organizations identify gaps early on and position themselves for success. So this is about taking fund-worthy projects to becoming fund-ready projects. So with that, it's my pleasure to soon hand over to our partners at Tsikululu, who can take us deeper into what institutional readiness means and actually provide you guys with practical guidance on strengthening governance and compliance. But moderator, may I ask, before we move on, do we need to pause and work through any of the questions that I have not yet addressed in the chat?
Thank you very much, Joe. No, there do not seem to be any questions in the chat at the moment. It's just mostly been people letting us know where they're from, which organizations they're representing. However, we do encourage, as the conversation continues, to please do pop them in here, and we will take note of them. I would like also just to apologize for the drawings that we had. We seem to have figured out how to sort it out. Thank you very much for your patience in that regard. Can we kindly ask that you please refrain from typing anything, drawing, or pushing anything directly on the presentation, just in case it does come through to the rest of us. We would greatly appreciate that. Yes, I will now hand over to my colleague, Matebe, who will take us briefly through who Tsikululu is, and then I'll let her dive straight into the core of our webinar today. Over to you, Matebe.
Thank you so much, Teresa, and good morning, everyone. And yes, today I would like to take you through Tshikululu Social Investments. So this is before we get into governance and institutional readiness. So for Tsikululu Social Investments, we have been working in the social investment or impact space for almost 3 decades. We've worked across South Africa's social investment landscape, managing trusts, advising funders, assessing organizations, and supporting implementation partners. So in that work, one pattern comes up consistently. Organizations are actually rarely declined because their idea or concept is weak, right? Mostly what we have seen from our experience is that they struggle to demonstrate governance, accountability, financial management, or even reporting capability. So in the JET funding platform, we saw the same thing, colleagues. Across hundreds of applications, many organizations were doing amazing, important work in their communities. However, there were still gaps in governance, there were still gaps in compliance, in financial systems, and even in reporting readiness, which often limited their ability to access funding on the platform and even beyond. So that's really the reason of today's session, colleagues. It's not about compliance for compliance sake. It's about assisting organizations so that they can actually be able to access this funding. So this brings us to the conversation of today, institutional readiness. When we talk about institutional readiness, specifically in the just transition, there's often a lot of focus on projects, on infrastructure, on technology, on jobs and skills, which are all very important. But colleagues, before funding can even flow, before projects can even scale, before organizations can even think of applying for requests for proposals or this type of funding, organizations need to understand, or rather need to demonstrate, that they are ready to manage resources responsibly. So institutional readiness is what sits between a good idea, a good concept, and a funded idea, right? A funded concept. So today we're going to unpack why that matters and what it means in practice, specifically whether you are a community-based organization, a nonprofit organization, a labor union, as the PMU mentioned, a municipality, or an SMME. These will still apply to you, colleagues. And then when we say institutional readiness, let's unpack that a bit about what do we mean. And here, colleagues, we simply mean an organization's ability to access, to manage, and to deploy funding responsibly. So there are actually 3 reasons for why this matters. The first, as you can see here, is that readiness helps funding translate into, readiness helps funding translate into confidence, right, that funders and investors need. And this is needed so that they can manage projects and actually be delivered. The second is that readiness supports inclusion, colleagues. Many communities and organizations that we've worked with based in communities are the closest to the challenges, right? You understand the opportunities of the just transition. However, these type of organizations, in our experience, often have the least access to governance and administrative support. So strengthening readiness really helps ensure that they can participate more meaningfully. And the third, but not least, is that it builds credibility, colleagues. Whether you are applying for 10 Rand, for 100,000 Rand, for 10 million Rand, funders and investors alike want assurance that there are systems, governance, and accountability mechanisms which are in place. So the reality is that readiness is often what determines whether funding moves forward or it stops. In our experience, we've seen organizations with strong community trust lose funding opportunities simply because they didn't have audited financial statements or a functioning board, right? At the same time, we have also seen funders and investors support organizations to strengthen those systems, because the project or concept itself was compelling. And this is where we go a bit deeper into institutional readiness and what forms institutional readiness. So this is commonly defined as the ability of an organization to plan, to implement, to sustain just transition projects effectively and responsibly. Colleagues, don't worry, we will be sharing, as Tshabisa mentioned, this presentation along with other tools post-webinar. So when you think about institutional readiness, what we found is that it's helpful to think about it in 5 interconnected building blocks. The first is governance and leadership. The second, financial and operational capacity. And then we have strategy and project readiness. And then stakeholder and community engagement. And last but not least, monitoring, evaluation, and learning. So if one of these areas of these building blocks is weak, this creates a risk for all the other areas. Let me give you an example. So an organization, whether you are a community-based organization, an SMME, or a municipality, you could have a great project with a great concept, but no financial controls. Or you could have strong governance, but limited evidence that communities have actually been engaged or consulted in your process. So funders and investors alike increasingly assess all these building blocks that you're seeing on your screen together. And as we move through the session, you'll notice that governance runs across many of these areas, which is why we've chosen also to focus on that aspect today. Together. And let's just unpack that a bit briefly. Governance is about how decisions are made. Risk management is about identifying what could go wrong and putting plans in place to mitigate and manage those risks. Compliance is about meeting legal and regulatory requirements. So for smaller organizations, these concepts can often sound intimidating. We understand. But colleagues, actually, many of you are already doing this, right? And whether your committee meets regularly and keeps minutes, that's governance. If you've identified risks and thought about how to address them, that's risk management. Just don't forget to have it also somewhere within your systems. If you've renewed your, let's say, your NPO registration or submitted the required documents, that's actually compliance. So colleagues, the goal here is not to create more complexity. The goal is to have enough structure to give confidence to funders, to your communities and partners. I hope it's making sense to somebody. And as mentioned, we will be sharing this presentation, so don't feel pressured to capture it all. So when we look at governance, colleagues, we want to see where governance fits within the investor readiness spectrum, right? So governance is a key indicator of fiduciary assurance. And this slide really gets to the heart of that. And let's unpack that a bit more. So funders or investors have their own accountability obligations, whether it is feeding back to presidency, whether it is citizens, if this is part of a organization or a government project, they are all accountable to someone. So what does this mean? It means that they need to explain how money, how investment, how resources that they've given were used and what impact has been achieved. So because of that, when a funder awards a grant, they are effectively extending their fiduciary responsibility to you as the organization that they support, right? So good governance tells a funder money will be managed responsibly. Decisions won't rest with myself as Matebe or one particular person. They ensure that there's oversight, there's accountability, your reporting can be trusted, as well as having strong governance helps to reduce the risk. It also increases investor and funder confidence. So that confidence, colleagues, often determines whether your funding is approved or not. Let me give it an example and paint a picture here. So as Tsikululu, what we've seen is that grant applications where the project or concept was excellent, but the organization had actually no independent oversight structure and no separation between management and governance. We've seen this in a number of projects, or rather organizations we've worked with. And colleagues, this will immediately raise a risk or concern with funders, with investors, or even communities and partners, right? Because if you don't have any proper oversight or management structures, there's no confidence that you're able to apply or implement that project in an independent and fair and just way. And now you may be sitting in the room and trying to understand, where do you fit in the spectrum? So actually, before anyone starts feeling like governance challenges are unique to your organization, it's not at all, colleagues. The reality that we found is that this is actually a challenge across the entire ecosystem. So research that we've done shows that municipalities, NPOs or nonprofit organizations, and businesses are all facing similar issues. Let me give you an example. In the latest municipal audit cycle, 83% of municipalities had material compliance findings. When we look at the NPO sector, over a third of organizations surveyed reported having no dedicated capacity for finance, for tax compliance, or even governance. And similarly, for small business, only 28% were formally registered and compliant with key regulatory requirements. So, colleagues, the challenge here isn't that organizations don't care about governance. The challenge is often capacity, resources, and competing priorities. And this is something we do understand. Many, especially community-based organizations, are delivering programs. You're raising funds and mobilizing resources, managing volunteers, responding to community needs, and doing administration with very few staff members. And what happens, the result that we've seen is that governance often becomes a secondary issue that is looked at, right? It becomes something organizations, they know that they need to have it, but often struggle to prioritize it. So in our work, we regularly see community-based organizations, implementing partners, municipalities with excellent project ideas. However, they never really make it past the due diligence stage. And this is not because the project itself, again, is weak. No, but this is because, for example, there are no audited financial statements. The board has not met in 2 years, or there are no signed policies. And maybe your financial records are incomplete and your reporting systems are not quite there yet. So in other words, organizations are being excluded because institutional readiness gaps that I've shown are focused on rather than the program quality. So let me bring it back to base and give you a common example, procurement, right? An organization might receive funding, let's say, to deliver a skills program or community project in a mining area. But when the funder or investor asks for your quotations, asks for your supplier records or evidence of the procurement process, which is, how your supplier is chosen, the organization is not able to provide these. Immediately, that raises a risk. And this also decreases the investor confidence. So here, again, colleagues, I think it's important to remember the issue is not the program, the concept, or the project itself. The issue is whether you as an organization can demonstrate accountability, right? And can demonstrate strong governance and management protection measures that also help to increase the investor and or funder confidence. What we've also seen among CBOs and NPOs and SMMEs is that they're deeply trusted by their communities. There's no seconding that. This is amazing work that you're all doing. And also, you know exactly the local challenges and often have strong relations right on the ground and in the communities. However, when funding opportunities arise and they are asked for, let's say, a constitution, committee meeting minutes, bank confirmation letter, tax documentation, financial statements, sometimes we found that these documents don't exist or haven't yet been updated. And unfortunately, colleagues, this can actually prevent strong organizations from being able to access funding. But please don't be stressed. That's why we're here today. The good news is that most of these gaps are fixable. You do not need a large finance department of 20, 40 people or sophisticated governance structures to start improving on your readiness. What funders and investors are generally looking for is evidence that you have oversight, right? You have accountability, transparency, as well as a willingness to change, to strengthen your systems over a period of time. And that's exactly why we're having this conversation today. And just like this conversation, we've talked about the just transition having many different players, some less formal in structure, and thus governance colleagues will look different across different constituencies. And let's unpack that a bit. But before we do, I think it's very important to remember that governance colleagues, it's not about having the same structure as everyone else. It's not about forcing yourself to fit in a particular type of box. Let me give you an example. A municipality, a labor union, a cooperative, an NGO, and private company, these all operate differently. And actually, a lot of funders understand that. So what they're looking for is not identical structures at all, but oversight and rather evidence that there's accountability, evidence that there's oversight, evidence that you have sound decision-making processes. Let's give an example. A municipality will have a council and various oversight committees, right? Well, I hope this is right. Yes, this is right. A private company will have directors and management structures. An NGO, an NPO may have a board of trustees or directors who are providing oversight. A cooperative, on the other hand, may have let's say, an elected management committee or a board that is accountable to its members through regular, the voting processes, where a CBO may have a committee or leadership that is guided by a constitution to its members and communities. So these are the governance structures, which, as you can already hear, they differ, right? But the questions, colleagues, will remain the same. And these are the questions that funders are largely asking. So who makes the decisions? Who provides oversight? Who is accountable if something goes wrong? How are funds and investments managed, as well as how are all stakeholders kept informed? Excuse me. So if you can answer these questions clearly, colleagues, you're already on your way to building institutional readiness. In fact, many funders and investors and donors are quite comfortable with smaller or less formal structures, you'll be surprised, provided that you have the evidence that decisions are transparent, responsibilities and roles are clear, and you have basic controls in place. So let me give you an example from some of our work. So we've actually managed, or rather currently managing, a gender-based violence program. And what we saw with very different structures, or rather what we saw when we put out requests for proposal, was that various organizations were applying for this funding opportunity. We had municipalities, nonprofit organizations, social enterprises, and community trusts. The strongest applications, surprisingly, weren't from the biggest well-known organizations or names, right? These were actually from organizations that could clearly demonstrate who was responsible for decision-making, how funds would be managed, and how they would report on results and impact. So actually here with this example, colleagues, we ended up choosing a community-based organization who just needed to update their board minutes and fix a governance gap. So again, here, the importance to remember is that regardless of what type of organization that you represent, the goal is not to copy another structure. The goal is to make sure that your own governance arrangements are fit for purpose and inspire confidence among funders, among partners, as well as among communities. And I know this feels like a lot, but again, I think I want to reiterate that we will be sharing this presentation as well as a self-assessment tool to bring back to theory what we've talked about today. And up until this point, I believe we've spoken a lot about governance from a funder's perspective, investor, donor perspective, right? But actually, and I think this is something you should all remember, governance is not only about funders at all. Good governance is also good for you as an organization. Adopting good governance practices has actually been proven to improve organizational growth, performance, And ultimately, guys, colleagues, it is good for business. So good governance creates real value for organizations. And what do we mean by this? Because when you have good governance already in place, it improves your transparency, it helps streamline processes such as procurement, it also protects your organization's reputation, and it reduces unnecessary risks, expenditures, and it supports growth. Ultimately, it can open the door to new funding and partnership opportunities. So in many cases, governance is actually what allows you as an organization to move from just surviving to growing to thriving. So here, I want you to think about governance as an enabler. And let me give you an example. Imagine two organizations applying for the same JET funding, right? Both have strong programs, committed staff, as well as deep community relationships. One organization can immediately provide their financial statements, board meetings, clear reporting process, as well as an evidence of oversight, right? Whereas the other organization cannot. More often than not, colleagues, the first organization will progress, right? Not necessarily because their project concept is stronger, but because the organization has given the funder confidence that the resources will be managed effectively. So we've actually seen this quite often in practice, where organizations are sometimes excluded from opportunities before their project is even assessed, right? Before basic governance or compliance requirements are even looked at. If these are not in place, you've already disqualified yourself. So colleagues, here, governance should not be viewed as a paperwork or just simply compliance for compliance sake. It's one of those things that helps you as an organization build your credibility, attract more resources, and position yourself for long-term sustainability. Again, it is an enabler to you making impact. So now that we've spoken about the building blocks, the critical areas around governance, let's look at an example. And at this point, you may be thinking, okay, this sounds all good in theory, but Machebe, can you actually give us an example of what this looks like in practice, right? So in 2024, Tsikululu was looking for a local organization, specifically in Gauteng, to help implement an education program. The organization was identified. They were doing excellent, amazing work in the community. They were trusted. They understood the local context. They also had a very strong program model. But when we did our due diligence assessment, we found actually that there were quite a few gaps. And similarly, across the sector, we've seen these gaps, right? They did not have audited financial statements. There wasn't a clear distinction between the role of the board as well as the role of the management. And there were also limited monitoring and evaluation processes that were in place. And colleagues, it's important to note here that actually, if you have been listening, none of these issues were relating to the organization's good work or their good programs. However, what it meant was that they simply were, they simply meant they were risks that needed to be addressed before larger amounts of funding could even flow. So rather than just walking away, what Tsikululu did was assisted in strengthening those governance parts or gaps, and that became part of the support and integration, right? So one of the grant conditions was that the organization had to complete an audit before receiving the next tranche payment. A new board was also established to provide independent oversight, and basic monitoring and evaluation processes were introduced so that they could better track and report on results and impact. And what we like about this example here is that, the changes, colleagues, they were not overly complicated or expensive. They were actually very practical steps that increased the investor confidence, that increased the stakeholder confidence. And the key takeaway here, colleagues, is that many organizations think that they need to have everything perfect, right, before you access funding or respond to a proposal or a request for proposal. In reality, funders actually already understand that organizations are still growing. What they want to see is that there is a willingness to strengthen these systems and address these gaps. So in this case, Once those improvements were made, the organization was actually able to access additional funding beyond Tshikululu and position itself for long-term sustainability. Again, governance was the thing that helped unlock the next opportunity. It was an enabler. And this is actually something that we've seen repeatedly over the years, having strong projects which often go unnoticed, but strong governance is what helps them grow, right? So it's important to know that even small improvements in governance can have a very real impact on your credibility, on partnerships, as well as future funding opportunities. So it's important here, colleagues, that you're just not waiting for the next funding opportunity to fix governance gaps, but you also use, let's say, downtime to ensure that you're always meeting these requirements so that when an opportunity does arise, you're ready to respond. And now we will have a break soon, colleagues, but just also to wrap up the conversation on good governance. We've spoken around the building blocks, around the critical elements, but let's try to simplify it a bit. And I know it's been a lot of information, but hopefully if you remember one thing, remember these 4 pillars around good governance: structure, accountability, controls, and transparency. So think of them as the 4 questions every funder is trying to answer when they assess an organization. Who makes the decisions again? Who is responsible? How are risks managed? And can we trust the information that is being provided? That's actually really what governance comes down to. A lot of organizations think that governance means having dozens of policies and procedures in place, but it often starts, colleagues, with answering these 4 questions clearly. Let's give an example. Imagine a community organization or an SME or a cooperative wants to run a skills development program for young people in a coal transitioning community. So a funder reviewing that proposal will want to know who is making decisions about the project. That is structure. Who is responsible for delivery and reporting? That is accountability. How project funds will be managed and monitored? That's controls. And also how communities and funders will know what has been achieved? That is transparency. And colleagues, these are the same questions being asked across many just transition funding opportunities. If someone today asked your organization who approves spending, who signs off on reports, how are your procurement decisions made, and where are your supporting documents kept, would everyone be able to give the same answer? Please feel free to answer in the chat. If yes, you're actually already in the right track, colleagues. And if not, that's actually where governance strengthening will begin. That will be your first journey. So here, it's important to note that these pillars apply, again, whether you're a cooperative, a municipality, a labor union, CBO, NPO, these will still apply to you. And now that we've also spoken and touched on a bit about the different constituencies, you probably want to see where you fit in the just energy transition space. So I'm not going to go through this table line by line. However, and this is because not every single detail is important, right? The important point is that governance, again, it does not have to look the same everywhere. A municipality has a council, an MPO may have a board, a business has directors, a cooperative may have an elected management committee. So again, different structures, but the same underlying principles. And that's part of, and that's particularly important in the just transition, because again, it brings together many different types of organizations and entities. You might have a municipality leading a local planning, a community organization engaging residents, a cooperative creating local economic opportunities, or a private company investing in infrastructure. These all play different roles, but funders again will go back to the same questions. Who makes the decisions? Who is accountable? How are your risks managed? And can progress funding, and how can funding be reported on transparently? So let's bring it back to base and give a bit of an example. A community cooperative running a solar installation program doesn't need the same governance structure as a municipality, right? Well, yes, that's right. But it still needs clear leadership. It still needs financial controls, and transparent reporting, especially if it wants to attract long-term funding and partnership opportunities. So that's why good governance, rather, is less about the type of organization that you may see here on the screen, and it's more about whether people can trust how you operate. So, colleagues, if you're going to leave here today with something, rather than comparing yourself to any other organization in the room, the better question is, do we have the right governance arrangements for our size and complexity of what we are trying to achieve? And now that we have discussed demonstrating results and building trust, let's look at another element that funders are increasingly assessing alongside governance, and that's monitoring, evaluation, and learning. So funders also want to understand whether you can measure and demonstrate these results that you've been talking about, right? And these 5 indicators that you see here are actually commonly used across the just energy transition projects to track performance, to track progress, and outcomes at project level. So because everyone reports against the same indicators for this specifically, it becomes actually plausible and possible to compare results across different projects, as well as aggregate data across the wider investments register. So again, the indicators will cover, as you've seen here, community involvement, institutional readiness, job creation, livelihoods, as well as emissions reduction. And what is important for today's discussion is that strong governance makes good reporting possible. Again, I'll say that strong governance makes good reporting possible. So if roles and responsibilities in your organization are not very clear, records are not really maintained, or data is not collected consistently, it becomes very difficult to demonstrate impact or results against any of these measures or any other measures you use within your organizations. We are also seeing an increasing focus on gender, colleagues, and that's something I want to highlight here, is that funders and investors are not only asking how many people benefit, not just numerical, but who benefited, where are the women, where are youth, as well as other vulnerable, other vulnerable groups? Have they been meaningfully included, as well as being able to access the opportunities that have been created through the transition, through your project? So these are also elements to consider. Ultimately, governance helps you deliver the work, while monitoring and evaluation will help you demonstrate results, as well as learn and adapt. I hope you're still with me. Again, we'll be taking a break shortly. So now going back to, or closing the conversation on how funding is approved. Before the conversation of funding is even approved, most funders will actually conduct some form of due diligence. So what you're seeing here are some of the common governance and compliance requirements that organizations are often assessed against. So here at Tsikululu, we also use some elements of this checklist as part of our own due diligence process. Whether we are assessing an MPO, a CBO, a municipality, a cooperative, or a social enterprise, many of these basics, colleagues, will actually remain the same. And the reason we like this list so much is because it's easy to remember. And also, if you can answer yes to 6 of these areas, let's go with founding documents, verified leadership, financial statements, registration, tax compliance, and banking verification, you're actually already on your way to covering a significant portion of what funders will typically ask for. Again, it's important to note that none of these elements on this checklist speak to whether your project idea was good or bad. They simply help funders understand and determine whether your organization is ready to receive and manage funding responsibly. So for those participating in the JET ecosystem, strengthening any of these areas, all of them preferable, can actually make a real difference when opportunities arise. Again, colleagues, this has been a lot of information we've delved into, but we will be sharing this checklist after the webinar together with a governance self-assessment tool. And the intention here, it's not for you to think of these elements as just as a compliance exercise, but rather they are practical tools that can help you understand where your organization is at currently in its journey, as well as identify areas for improvement on your governance journey. So with that, colleagues, I'm going to hand back over to my colleague, Tshikululu, who will run us through the breakout sessions before we go for a quick comfort break. Over to you, Tshikululu.
Thank you very much, Matebe. And yes, so as she said, we are aware that this is quite a lot of information, and really the purpose of today wasn't to try and make sure that we all memorize everything all at once, but just to make sure that even after we have shared the slides with you, there is enough information for you to read up more on and be able to further unpack for yourselves. Before we go to our comfort break, I thought I would take this opportunity just to quickly respond to some of the questions that are in the chat. There are some questions that came after Joe's presentation and throughout Matebe's presentation as well. So Joe, if you are happy, there are some that I will direct to you, and I know there are some that you responded to into the chat, but for the purposes of everyone else who maybe has missed them, there was a question from Leanne asking the types of funding that is available. Is it only just grant funding, or is it loans? What are the financing structures available?
Perfect. And I think I did address that one in the chat, but for the benefit of everyone, look, there's grant funding that exists in the ecosystem, absolutely. But I think the point of this discussion is that institutional readiness is still required to even unlock grant funding. So we, within the funding platform, are really looking to channel grants into projects, but that needs to be tied to a growth plan and a capital structure plan that can go from a grant to something potentially more concessional, all the way up to, commercial finance as these projects grow, scale, and deliver.
Thank you for that, Joe. A second question from Kanyisa, which is also related to, sort of funding structures available through JET. The question was, how has JET tailored its financing specifically for micro enterprises, and whether or not there are strategic partnerships that are already in the pipeline with microfinancing institutions to broaden their definitions for the definition for institutional readiness. And to offer, the investments.
Sure. Okay, that's a mouthful. It's a couple of questions in one. I think it does also link just to a question I saw, which now I'm scrolling through the chat and I can't find it, which was more around also size, right? And what are we talking about when we talk about size? So I think perhaps just to start off, and then I'd love to, if Carmen, if you're on the line, also just lean on you around this question. So two things, our windows are kind of tailored anywhere around a 1 million funding ask to sort of maybe the 20, and that's not to say that we can't look bigger, and it's not to say that we can't necessarily look smaller either, but that's just a little bit of guidance around the sort of sweet spot, maybe 1 to 40 million on the upper end. And then the next thing that I'd like to say is that we don't necessarily have confirmed partnerships with microfinance organizations at this stage. But part of the work that we do here, we are working with the project originators, and the reason the team consists of a funders analyst and a projects analyst is because we're equally looking to develop relationships with pools of capital continuously, because the funding landscape is not static, and even the providers of grant capital in the geopolitical context that we find ourselves in is changing as well. So always open to conversations and to insights as well around funding partners that have been constructive in your space. So I open the door there. Carmen, I don't know if there's anything you want to add to this question around microfinance and the size of transactions.
Carmen, I think unmuting should be enabled for you now. Can you please nod your head if you can? Okay, let me sort that out for you.
There we go. I think you can probably hear me now. Hi, everyone, and it's so wonderful to have such a full room. So on the SMME side, I mean, largely for us as the funding platform, it's really about matching projects with funders. And so what we have had is there's a number of projects that are either on our register or we have matched with funding that specifically support small business. And very often in those sort of projects, they'll have a number of support mechanisms, sometimes grants, sometimes a little bit more, maybe recoverable grants, sometimes some concessional funding, and they all sort of focus on different areas. And so we've seen a lot of those sort of proposals coming in, and obviously there's also a lot of support for that. It's specifically looking at sort of the domestic grant funding environment. But what we're also seeing, so if you think that our mandate is to do that, right, and to support sort of high-level project preparation and investment readiness, which this is sort of part of. But we want to, and one of our key constituents are SMMEs, and obviously SMMEs or MSMEs are MSMEs are really critical to the JET, right? And so increasingly we're going to be focusing far more on how we can support that ecosystem. And we have some sort of views on later this year of how we're going to see how we can support the graduation of small businesses. So very often it's just about linking up a small business, understanding what the need is and saying, you know, within the ecosystem, you can go here and you can go here. They have that sort of finance that you are actually requiring. What we are finding is that a lot of projects that come to us are looking for grant finance, but they are looking for grant finance to actually build out their operations. And it's very challenging to find grant finance for that. It's just not aligned with what grant financiers actually pay for. But a lot of these other recoverable grants and in the SME ecosystem, there are more of those sort of programs. And so our goal is to see later in the year how we can support that in a much more, instead of linking you up then with a grant funder, it's with the right type of finance that will enable growth, right? So grant finance usually very seldom is used to support operational growth, especially, in some circumstances it is, but very seldom. So I hope that's helpful. So we are aware and we are thinking about how we can support that in the funding, in the funding platform. But at this stage, we don't actually have any of those tools at our disposal to deploy. Thanks.
Thank you very much to Joe and Carmen. I do also just want to note that I know there are a lot of questions coming up when it comes to other enterprise development opportunities, the type of financing that's available. Just for everyone to note that this is the first out of 5 webinar sessions that we will be having. And in fact, some of the questions that you have will be posed, will be answered going forward. So just also to take note of that. I did see a question earlier on just around, and I'll use that as our last sort of wrapping up before we go for a comfort break, just around Tsikululu and the opportunities that are available through us for enterprise development. Firstly, Tsikululu only operates within South Africa. We have had international clients, but our work is based here in South Africa. In terms of enterprise development, ourselves directly as Tsikululu, we do not implement those projects, but through supporting our clients, we have helped them with designing enterprise development, sort of programs to support, particularly to support local SMMEs and local CBOs. So opportunities like that do exist, and often we would, sort of advertise them on our websites and so forth. So just we'll wrap it up in that way. As indicated, I see, Joe, you have your hand.
I'm so sorry to jump in. Just on the wrap up there, because there were a couple of other questions, including creating a network. And I think Jacques was asking, how do we put people in contact? And we have POPI issues and we can take that offline. But just one last thing that I wanted to ask is, we do also have the ability for all of you to register to our stakeholder registration platform. So Piwe, if you could just post that link there, and you can follow us on LinkedIn as well. So some of these questions can be answered around future windows and the likes, and you can hunt us down via LinkedIn. But if you register with us on our database, we will make sure that targeted information reaches you as well, and we'll post that link and pin it in the chat. Sorry to jump in.
No, thank you very much for that, Joe. And in fact, I did. Someone did ask about networking and so forth. I know a lot of people have been putting their names and which organization they come from. We definitely do encourage you to reach out to each other in the meantime through LinkedIn and those kinds of platforms as well. And just get the conversations going. We're really glad to see that this series is not only becoming about information sharing, but is now starting to become a platform for connecting people and collaborating, which is great. Again, I do want to note that we will have a final Q&A session when we come back after the breakaway sessions. So please, if there is any question that we have missed, we will make sure that it is answered. But just for the interest of time, we'd like to ask everyone to please be back at 11:15. You will notice that once you come back for the meetings, you will all be assigned into one of 3 breakaway rooms. And then from there on, you will be under the care of myself, Sivu, or Bertha as well, depending on the breakout room that you will be in. Thank you very much, everybody, and we will see you at 11:15.
Okay, I think we are back. Please confirm.
Yes, we are back from room 3.
Awesome. Okay, colleagues, let's get started. Well, first of all, thank you to everyone for being so engaging. And I'm just going to give it a moment. I see we're wrapping up one of the rooms. Okay, so once again, thank you to Sivu, to Trebisa, and to Bertha for leading our conversation, but most especially, colleagues, thank you to you for being so engaging, for being so open in the discussions. And it's also interesting to see, or rather the benefits of having mixed groups, right? We had municipalities, NBOs, community organizations, as well as businesses in the room. So one thing was clear. While our contexts may differ, their challenges, especially around governance and compliance, are similar. So some of the themes that I saw emerging were firstly that governance and compliance are not unique to any one type of organization. The challenges which were emerging were around affordability, specifically around audited financials. There were some great ideas about outsourcing where possible so that your team is also not overburdened. One of the rooms also brought up the difficulty in following regulatory requirements, right? Specifically because they are so many, and oftentimes, especially newer organizations, don't really know where to go. And again, a big barrier that we noted was capacity constraints. So it's very clear that everyone involved, or rather everyone in the room, said that they would like to improve their governance standing. They would like to work on investor readiness. However, capacity constraints usually limits this type of focus, specifically around resourcing when they have small teams. So a third theme rather was also the use of AI and technology to make your life easier. And of course, AI, colleagues, it's not without its own issues. So here we do encourage you as well to make sure that you have the proper settings in place, with the AI you are using, remembering as well our laws such as POPIA and sharing sensitive information, but also providing AI with some leading questions to be able to better serve you. So again, we talked about some of the tools that will be shared, and colleagues did state that they thought they would be quite helpful, including the self-governance assessment tool, as well as the due diligence checklist. Because again, this can sometimes feel like a lot of information. So going back to our earlier conversations, I know there were a lot of comments around where is the funding? However, remember, colleagues, the purpose of today's discussion is even before we start thinking, of funding opportunities, please do self-assess as an organization to see where you are in your governance journey. This will make the whole funding application process much easier. But I think at this time, I want to hand over to the facilitators. If there's anything that I may have missed in your rooms that was particularly highlighted, yeah, let us know. Over to you. Let's start with Tshikululu.
Sure. Thank you, Matebe. You pretty much covered it. As you indicate, at least particularly in my room, the big thing was just around audited financials and just financial management in general, especially for small NPOs. One positive thing, I mean, we had quite a bit of discussion, although I do feel the 20 minutes went by very quickly. But just as we share resources and, knowledge sharing, we had one person, Sarita, recommend a platform called QuickBooks, and that has a free bookkeeping version that smaller NPOs can make use of. So I just thought that it would be valuable to extend this to everybody else, because I'm sure it wasn't only in our meeting room where we had people who are struggling with finding financial management systems that are not very expensive.
That's a good one. Thank you for that, Clarissa. Let's go to Bertha. Over to your room. How are those discussions?
Thank you. Thank you, colleagues. So the 20 minutes went by so quickly. However, for the colleagues that managed to get their points across, there was an issue on funding for PTYs. So there is a preference for donors to consider non-profit companies instead of small or startups, which are private PTY limited. And also there was a suggestion to say organizations must consider using auditors or financial companies to be able to deal with all these compliance and governance issues rather than trying to tackle them themselves. And also there was also a point around what documents or how to upload documents on the DSD, on the Department of Social Development website, as well as other platforms. However, we ran out of time very quickly, and I think we need to apologize to the participants in room one, because then we also had another tech issue and they couldn't finish their points. So apologies to participants in room one. Please, may you put all your points in the chat.
Thank you, colleagues. So very interesting insights coming from your room, Bertha. And again, the power of AI, the good, the bad, the ugly, we take it all. So colleagues, in our post-webinar share, we will also have an FAQ. So if any of your questions were not addressed in the main room or in your breakaway sessions, we'll also make sure to send that along with the governance self-assessment tool, as well as the due diligence checklist. And last but not least, I had heard some riveting conversations coming from your room, Sivu. Do you want to give us a little summary of how that went?
Thank you, Matebe. Honestly, I think I had the best room. My participants, we were flowing. We even wanted longer time. In the session, we had great when we used the poll, and we had a great session when we were also discussing how do people pull together when it's part of resources that we are lacking as an organization. And yes, AI did come through, but I think one of the highlights that was echoed is that AI can generate generic information. So it will be great to just capacitate our audience on how to actually use AI effectively. But also the question that I couldn't answer, I think that came when we were actually asked to go to the bigger room, was around audited financial statements. And the question was that, are audited financial statements important than independently reviewed financial statements? The answer for me was that yes, audited financial statements are often important when applying for funding, as they provide funders with independent assurance that the organization's financial information is accurate and that appropriate financial controls are in place. But we also know that it also differs from funders because it's so important to always look at the due diligence requirements of those funders, as some funders funding programs will be distinct in saying that they want audited financial statements, while others do accept independently reviewed financial statements. And I thought I'd actually answer that question in here, but I know, as you had said, Mateba, there'll be a Q&A pack that we'll send to our audience as well to just highlight why we say that audited financials are important. But it was a great discussion, great room, and I thoroughly enjoyed engaging with Group 2 audience. Thank you, Mateba. Back to you.
Thank you for that, Sivu. Very interesting insights coming out from that room. And colleagues, yes, we will address these in the FAQ. So if there's an element you feel we have not touched on, please do share. And again, today's conversation is to remind us that, yes, while investor readiness, governance, compliance, and risk are important, they are not a one-size-fits-all approach, right? And I think that's exactly what Sivu was bringing out from that breakaway discussion, is that understand the funding platform you are applying for and utilize these tools we've shared today into that platform, right? So of course, different investors, funders, and donors have different requirements. However, let's say the ethos, or rather the concepts around governance, around risk, around accountability and transparency remain the same across the board. And with that, colleagues, we have a few minutes to wrap up, and I'm going to hand over back to you, Tshabisa, to wrap us up and maybe give us a little more insight about the next windows, or rather the next webinars, and what to expect. Over to you. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Matebe. And yes, thank you very much to everyone who has been with us for this webinar. It does feel like it's been a bit of a sprint, really just getting through some of the content and the discussions. And we really do want to say thank you for engaging with us either through the chat and particularly in the breakaway sessions. I think just as a final reflection and as we close, the main thing to just remind everyone about today is that institutional readiness is not a one-size-fits-all exercise, and that it really is important for everyone to take their own context into consideration. We're looking forward, as indicated, this is webinar 1 out of 5. We do have 4 more to go over the next couple of months, and we please implore you to have a look out for the announcements for these on our LinkedIn pages, both Tsikululu's LinkedIn as well as the JET PMU's LinkedIn pages and other social media pages. We will also be sharing communication via email addresses. For today's webinar, as promised, we will be sharing a recording of today's webinar with you, as well as the full presentation, and of course the governance self-assessment tool that we have been referring to. It is an Excel document, and you will see that it does come with instructions on how to make use of it. And so we hope that it will be easy and sort of intuitive to make use of. And then lastly, we have tried to, as much as possible, considering time constraints and just the sheer size of everyone in our webinar today, to get through as many questions. But we will consolidate all of these and all of the responses as well that we've gotten through the Slido into FAQs, especially around additional support that is available and other avenues in which you can sort of find out more about the JET PMU, the funding platform, and how to access funding. With that being said, I would like to wish everybody a fantastic afternoon, and thank you very much for joining us. We will see you soon.